on that positioning mechanics video.
All right, I'm going to throw it to Tony Carilli now for a portion of his presentation. Also, guys, there's been a couple of questions about taking a break. Yeah, you're probably drinking coffee. Go take a leak if you got to take a leak. I mean, it's no big deal. We're going to roll through it and keep going, and then just jump back on whenever you get an opportunity, whenever you can. I'll bring it to Tony now.
All right, guys. This is a presentation some of you might have seen last year or last week or a couple weeks ago in the ODUA room, but I figured we'd try to have a little bit of fun here and try to think about situations in a slightly different manner. And then if we have a little time, we'll show the video a little bit at the end. I'll try to push this through and kind of relate it to that and let John jump in on a couple of things here too. But right now you see I hope you see a YouTube on my screen. I want to show you something and ask you if you ever thought your games might look like this. And boy, oh boy, if your game looks like that, that's an issue, right? So one of the things that I thought might be interesting, because some of you guys may or may not know, I am a firefighter, and I had to take a hazardous materials incidents course. And I couldn't understand why the guy was talking about baseball the entire time. So I wanted to, I don't know why my thing's not forward in here. There we go. I wanted to figure out why he was talking about baseball while he was talking about hazardous materials. And hazardous materials has a model and a way of deciding about prevent harm in the incidence of hazardous material, and it seemed like it would fit exactly into handling situations. So we're going to add a little bit of something off the cuff, a little bit cheeky, especially on a snowy day and you're all sitting in front of the computer, and see what you think. So the question I wanted to know is, what can we learn from handling hazardous material incidents, right? These guys, when they handle this, you just saw the video, and this is the worst thing that can happen to them, or amongst the worst things. Imagine worse than that, chemical things and stuff like that, whereas the worst thing that's going to happen to us is maybe that. And well, you know, while that's not very pleasant, it certainly isn't that. So if these guys can learn to handle very stressful situations, what can we learn from them? So the question is, what would you rather handle, a hazmat situation or a baseball situation? And I think most of us would handle baseball, and the reason that I say this is, look, at the end of the day, how we handle these things makes us better umpires. But at the end of the day, nobody's going to die on the baseball field. Nobody's going to be vastly hurt. So these situations shouldn't be thought of as stressful as something like these other guys do. But the hazardous material guys are under incredible stress all the time, and they deal with it. And what I thought it'd be really interesting to think about how they deal with it and see how what we learned about preventing that tanker explosion you just saw could help us on a baseball field. So that's what I'm after. Okay? And a hazmat is basically defined as anything that can jump out of its container and harm you if something goes wrong. Well, think about that on a baseball field. A hazardous material is something that jumps out of its container. A player explodes. Players get angry with each other. They fight. They get angry with you. They yell at you, those sorts of things. So that's kind of hazardous material. In a hazardous materials incident, there's a bunch of different kinds of harm. That acronym TRACEM stands for thermal, radiological, asphyxiation, chemical, etiological, that's a word for Bob, and mechanical. Those things are pretty awful things that can happen if you don't handle a situation right. But for us, I tried to come up with a similar acronym, and I got throwing incidents, ejections, fights, and forfeitures. So we have to worry about TEF. And what we would like to do is prevent harm. So what we want to try to do is think about an incident preventing harm. And in the old days of handling hazardous materials, there was a model called basically the attack and suppress. Firefighters love to run at problems and suppress them. A lot of umpires used to be like that in the old days, right? Hey, shut the blank up in there. Hey, you zip it. Hey, knock it off, right? The attack and suppress method. The problem is it put first responders in jeopardy in the real world, and it's starting to put us in jeopardy in the modern world in terms of just yelling at people and telling them to shut up. It just doesn't work that way. The other way that hazardous materials guys used to handle incidents was called the rule of thumb. You'd roll up on a scene, hold your outstretched hand in front of you. You know, everybody imagine if you held your outstretched hand in front of you with your thumb up, and then hold your eye over it and look to see if you can see any of the scene outside your thumb. Well, if you can, then you're too doggone close and you got to get away. Well, a lot of umpires would handle situations similarly. They would put their thumb up, that is, they would put their hands over their ears figuratively and ignore things. So we have to find a balance between ignore and jump on it and attack it and suppress it. So what we need to do is understand how these things work, and the same things don't work for all in situations. And the name there, Benner, he's the father of modern hazardous materials incidents, a guy named Ludwig Benner. So in the GEBMO is called the General Behavioral Model of Hazardous Materials. And the argument is, if you look at that BLEVE that we saw there, which is just a boiling liquid expansive vapor explosion, try to remember that for the test, because I think it'll be on John's test, but not on the NCAA test. All of these things, remember, a hazardous material is any material that really gets out of its container and goes to places where you want. All of you have hazardous materials in your house right now underneath your sink in your garage, but they're in containers so they don't cause problems. So what happens is there's stress on a container. If the stress is enough, it breaches the container, gets out, releases into the environment, engulfs the environment, puts impinge on critical systems, and for us the critical system is a game. And then if we don't prevent it from there, it's harm. So basically what we want to try to do is see if we can interrupt this process. Depending on where we are, we would do different things to interrupt it. So if we're only at the stress stage, can we relieve the stress? If we start to have it leak out a little bit, can we contain the leak? Once it's released, can we keep it from impinging? Once it's in, or engulfing, once it's done that, and that's kind of the goal. And if you think about it, I think a lot of it fits for baseball. So knowing what stage you're incident in determines the strategy. So we have kind of a prediction model. So if you think about how it works for us, ask yourself, are the participants in a baseball game under at least some kind of stress? Well, sure they are. They want to win. Coaches want to keep their jobs, so there's some stress. Can that stress lead to a breach? That is frustration or anger. Sure it can. If it breaches, do we get outbursts? Do guys do things? Well, sure they do. If that engulf, that release causes an engulf, does it affect other participants? Think about what chirping does and ignoring chirping, or guys hollering at each other back and forth does. It starts to involve other participants. And if that does, it's going to impinge on the progress of the game. It's going to make the game move in a way that we don't want it to move. So finally, the game itself may be harmed, and what we want to do is prevent harm to the game. So in that event, the hazardous materials guys invented, or Ludwig von Benner invented a process he called the decide process. Right? When we become aware of the existence of an emergency, that is, we become aware, and if we're on a baseball field, it's kind of the same sort of thing. We have to keep our ears, our antenna up, or as somebody likes to say, I think it's probably on this call somewhere, is you got to keep your finger on the pulse of the game. So what we want to do is try to affect or influence the sequence, that stress, breach, release sequence, and prevent that from becoming harm. So the idea is, first we have to detect a hazardous material presence, estimate the likely harm without intervention. This is called the decide model. Choose a response, identify the action, do the best option, and evaluate progress. And that fits very well, I think, for handling situations in baseball. So detect means, do you see a hazardous material? I always claim, and it's a weird thing, and I do it just more or less to get people to listen, you got to have rabbit ears. That doesn't mean you have to react to everything, but you're in charge of the baseball field. I think it says somewhere in the rule book, and Bob can correct me if I'm wrong, but it does say you are Lord Liege of all you purvey. Maybe not exactly in those words, but pretty close. But it's our job to know what's going on the baseball field. And if we don't detect a hazardous material, the stress or something about to happen, we can end up being surprised by things. And we know an umpire's worst enemy is surprise. So that's what we're trying to get at. So the next event in that is, what would happen if we ignored it, right? Run a movie through your head. What would happen if you ignored what was going on the field? One of the examples I've used before is, what if you ignore the chirping out of the dugout from you calling a pitch or a strike? What happens if you ignore that? Well, a lot like you would ignore your kids if you have kids when you're on the telephone, at some point they're going to yell louder and louder.